Hello. So as I promised, I would complete the lectures by adding a video, which is this. I'm recording it straight, so I don't get the opportunity to edit it. So it could be a bit, could be a bumpy ride, be a bit rough. But after I've recorded it, I will edit it and I'll replace the YouTube video with a better one, which I'll get put on Blackboard for you. Okay. So we covered, a few announcements. That's all right, forget them. Digital leadership. We covered in the lecture, in the workshop, we covered the claims of digital technology more generally to suggest that perhaps the claims were overplayed. But we also talked about narratives, narrative vehicles of conviction that convince ourselves that something is good or something has value, even in the face of some of the evidence that we have. So we also suggested that the digital provides us with new stuff that we haven't seen before. And that's evident, isn't it? That's from business models, platforms, networks, data. They're principally the main ones, I think. And digital culture, that's another one, thinking about how the digital shapes our culture, possibly as a consequence of misorganization. If you remember that, we talked about misorganization, which is siloing change. And not embedding the change throughout the organization, assuming that somebody's going to do it for us and that therefore we can limit our own agency. We talked a lot about balancing agency and structure, the things that confine you. Culture is another aspect that may well confine you, along with other things such as finance and the need to make returns and so on and so forth. And we also talked about change and about managing change. And managing change is difficult. Managing digital transformations is difficult. Put them both together and you've got something which is more difficult. And what this section does for us now is it suggests that things aren't hopeless. We can make change. We might not be able to make the sweeping kinds of change that we would like. We're not in that position. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't do something different in order to be able to promote and enhance the changes that are required or are demanded by the organization. Prior to that, of course, one needs to make the decision as to why we're actually embarking upon the changes of which we have decided. What's the point? In other words, what's and I use this word telos, T-E-L-O-S, telos. What's the end point? What's the end point that we're trying to determine? I've argued that if we can't effectively describe honestly and openly where we are now and where we're going to try and attempt to get to, then that processes of change is difficult, principally because if we don't know where we are, how do you unfreeze it? If you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there, and how do you freeze it? And furthermore, is that the process between unfreezing and freezing demands that we do something differently. We change. Well, if we can't map out the steps, then that is problematic as well. And when we looked at change, we looked at planned change, Lewin's models, and we also looked at emergent change. And my argument is that whilst both frameworks have got their merits, that just maybe in the digital era, is that both are deficient. And really what we need is more of a polyphonic voice, which amalgamates the two. So we need to look at where we are, where we're going, and the steps along the way. So we can plan our change. Otherwise, whatever we achieve good, bad, or indifferent, are just accidents. So we really ought to think about planning where we're going. But then on top of that is that we can use the tactics and the strategies of the emergent approach in order to be able to manage change much more effectively. And it's those strategies that I have suggested constitute digital leadership. And digital leadership looks different to models of leadership of the past. Now, we've talked about models of leadership in the past in terms of authenticism, and we've talked about all sorts of other models and so on and so forth. And this does not detract from anything that I've said before. I don't think it undermines anything that I've said before. I think it just requires that a different approach to the way that we lead is required. And we shouldn't get wrapped up in the self-centered and egotistical models of leadership, which are, for the most part, they're not empirically derived. We all know that leadership is charismatic, inspirational, motivational, and so on and so forth. But we don't know many people like that. Indeed, if we've ever worked for somebody like that. And without the empirical evidence, remembering, of course, brackets, we're social scientists, we deal with evidence, close brackets. Without the evidence to confirm our views of the world and our theories, then maybe just what we've got is a shitty theory. And so that leads me to suggest that we ought to really be doing something different. And that's building upon what we've talked about in the previous unit, but also structuring it around these notions of change, which we haven't talked about. So all of these, in fact, all of the units build towards another little piece of you as a manager, leader, practitioner, leading and managing your organization through a routine of better habits. And so let's set out what those habits ought to be for the digital leader. Now, there's very little literature on digital leadership, and where there is some literature, it focuses just on the digital. It's all about the technology. Well, the technology is paradoxical. It can be helpful and it can be a hindrance. It can be a blight as much as it might be a boon. It can be a challenge as much as it is an opportunity. And we need to consider all of those aspects of it, which is why I've focused the lecture series and this course on thinking about dualisms, continuity and change, agency and structure, power and compliance. Because it's my contention that the digital leader, or the leader, if you like, that works within a digital environment, and inevitably we're going to become more digitalized over time as that we implement more technology, irrespective of whether or not it does us any good. It's going to happen. And as a consequence of that is that the leaders of the future, it's not the future, is it? The leaders of the today need to be able to balance countering arguments. And there's two ways of doing it. Is that we can look at them dialectically, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or we can dialogically build upon previous notions. Whichever strategy we take, and both are admirable and both would work, is this dualistic notion of ambidexterity that I think is utterly essential within a digital world, which is typified by Isaacson's statements about Jobs. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Jobs was the perfect leader, because I don't believe that he is. There are a number of different people that were responsible for the management and the leadership of Apple. And as a consequence of that as well, I would assert that whilst Jobs' big picture details and so on and so forth was able to be comfortable with ambiguity, with ambidexterity, is that he also used other people to help him do it. And that's the crux of the matter. It's not something that can be done individually, but individually we need to maintain an open stance as to possibilities. So looking at this table then, I've said there are three significant changes for leaders of the future or of the today. One is a shift towards more of a network focus, is that you're distant from your workforce. But remembering, of course, is that one of the claims made by Bones and Hammersley is that successful relationships are what build successful companies and successful leading. Leaders have relationships with followers, which is difficult to be able to achieve in an era where we are fragmented and we are distant from each other. But nevertheless, it's not insurmountable. And the networks and the utilization of networks is a way in which we can build our relationships. I don't think that it's sufficient currently for us to be able to initiate and to build very, very deep relationships. But if you remember back to the original workshop, we talked about relationships as a function of exchange, which builds trust and reciprocity. Networks are built by reciprocity. Continue the process of exchanging information in your networks and looking for opportunities with which you can build your networks. Sharing the successes of communities and helping build those. Ultimately, the networked leader is less about himself or herself and is more about the network. The leader will be selfless, more selfless. Okay, we're shifting the network itself comprises of a space of flows. The nodes are the architecture of the network. You are a node within a network, but it is the flow of information and the exchange of information that flows between the nodes that builds the success of the network. The communities and the projects are networks within themselves that reside within a network, and they can spill out and learn so much from other networks if that kind of behavior is encouraged, which means to suggest that organizations will probably be less proprietal and they'll be more open to the way in which we do things. The technology lends itself to them. We talked about business models, and business models demand an appreciation of this ambidextrous perspective. It's less about the charisma, it's less about me and the inspiration and the motivation, and it's more about the leader generating meaning, sense, and operating on a co-constructive perspective. The leader of today within the digital environment is more open to everything. And in a world which is based on data, is that the focus therefore is about change, continual, progressive change, but you're not without agency. And change means that the world looks uncertain. The leader of today, the digital era, the digital leader, needs to be comfortable with ambiguity, not knowing, and to have strategies in order to be able to cope with that. And that's not working harder in order to find the data so that we know, because as we said before, tomorrow is unknowable, it's uncertain. We have to be comfortable with that. So it's less therefore about the vision which determines what tomorrow is going to look. It's more complex. It's less single-minded and more many-minded, which means that the posture that the leader needs to take is one of being adaptive. So let's try and deal with those as we go through. We've all experienced social networks, but whilst the networks are interesting, it's not particularly useful, our interest in them. What is interesting is the notion of the nodes and the flows. Remember Castell's perspective of the network society, where the space of the place is overridden by a space of flows, and it's flows between the nodes. The leader needs to see themselves as less at the top of a pyramid and a node connected to many other nodes. The strength of your connection is determined by a reciprocal flow of information. That could be information that's meaningless, but then that's likely to not have so much of a significant effect. What is more important is a flow of information that has utility, honestly exchanged, not withheld. Well, there's a limit to that, isn't there? Because we can't share proprietary information or commercial information, but we can share issues and solutions. We can share connections and information more generally, something that's done openly and transparently and on a reciprocal basis will build the network. So you've got nodes and flows. Each node's behavior is not determined. You have agency. You can decide what you do. So you shape your own networks. The structure of the network comprises the flows between the individual nodes. The network is open to distortion, therefore. In other words, you can't plan it because you can't determine how other people will behave and how you might connect. And you need to be aware of the possibilities of connections that exist tomorrow that don't exist now. And indeed, it might well be through your own agencies that you can create distortions by suggesting, well, I need to get to X. I need to find out somebody who's, I don't know, let's say, professor of economics, for whatever reason, or whatever it is. I want to get to the chief executive. How do I get to the chief executive? Well, he's got a certain group of people that he's very particularly friendly with. Do I know any of those? No. Do I know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody? Can I get there through an extended route of contacts, of connection? Do I reach out to smaller connections and to see whether or not they are able to help in this endeavor? Small connections can have big impacts and big distortions, not only on your own network, but also on the networks that you're connected to. It's a strange concept, isn't it? But it's one in which it's like a ripple in a pond, which ripples out, coruscates out. Well, that's one network spreading out. Well, if you drop lots of pebbles into the pond at the same time, you get all of this potential distortion. Consider that to be agency. And plotting your way through that is a strategic endeavor that takes work. It needs to be planned. What's the telos? What's the outcome? What are you trying to achieve in this? Have a plan. It's not just a simple case of just sending out information, although that will build the network, but will it build the network that you want? That's the most important aspect. And within a network, we get what's referred to as networked identity, people like you. There's a perception of oneness with other people, with a group of people. We have a desire for affiliation, don't we? Why do we do what we do? Why do we belong to clubs? Why do we join the golf club? I like golf, but I like being with other people that play golf as well. That's not me, by the way. I can't stand golf. But that's not true. I just don't want to play. Individuals tend to classify others as being part of a group. What's the prototypical characteristics? Prototypical characteristics of people that are involved in your industry, as an example, or your role within your industry, contract manager, project manager, whatever it is. Supported by visions, missions, value statements, performance management, budgeting, and competency. All of these things build your characteristics, your beliefs, your affiliations, your modes of operandi. And they promote a degree of harmony, but they also determine homogeneity, sameness. And that's the problem with prototypicality, is that we like people like us that are typical of us or of the group. But the group can very swiftly move into group thinking, being the same. So we need to find ways of actually extending and reaching out beyond our network and beyond the prototypical in order to be able to develop the network. Identity with a group is voluntary. It's better, isn't it? But it may give rise to an apparently sincere form of acceptance. we need to be seen to be part of that group rather than be embedded and really part of that group. So there's some challenges in terms of dealing with our own identities within networks. Networks have got what's known as components, embeddedness, structural patterning, network utility, and social relations. Embeddedness is the depth through which we are actually part of a network, how large the node is and the flow of data that comes from it. The bigger the network, the more of a flow. And I guess the best way you can think about this is sort of how many likes does it get? How many followers does somebody get? And that's a state of embeddedness. Structural patterning refers to the kind of like the patterns of information that you receive. So you get information from one person, many people infrequently. It's the structural patterning is who dominates the informational flow. Is it you might have lots of small contacts, other nodes, but you only really talk it to one or two people. Well, reach out, change the pattern. Utility. What's the point of the network? The network needs to have some point to it. What do I want to achieve? Tell us. What does the end point look like? And it's based on social relations. And as I've said before, social relations are based upon exchange, free exchange, which builds trust. Trust is established through reciprocity, give and ask. More than that, good networks build social capital. Social relationships about sharing information, establishing trust, build social capital. Social capital is the ultimate utility of a network. What does it do? Build social capital in order to do something. The social capital determines the effectiveness of the network. Just thinking about your own people, working with your own people, slightly shifting point, should have been a subdividing slide there, but there isn't. It's me, all right? Just shifting the analysis a little bit. There's a difference between engagement and commitment. Commitment is an attachment and emotional commitment to the organization. See that as being commitment. I'm committed. I have an attachment to my organization. Commitment is driven through the activities that build the success of the enterprise, the business, the firm. Okay, we'd all like committed people. Actually, we'd rather have people that are engaged with the organization. The amount of discretionary effort he or she is willing to devote to work activities. So think about whether you're committed to the network, to the firm, to the endeavor, or whether or not you're engaged. Engagement is driven through the activities that build the success of the individual. Remembering that the network comprises nodes. People that work with you are nodes within a network. They can build the network just as effectively as you do. How can we get them to engage? Well, engagement is driven through the activities that build the success of the individual. You, as a line manager or as a leader, are uniquely predisposed in order to be able to help someone build their own successes. It will reflect upon you. Exchange, trust, reciprocity, social capital, networks. How do you do it? Meaningful conversations, or just not there. Grandmother teaching. I don't wish to teach grandmother how to suck eggs. You know how to do it. And the evidence about positive correlation to performance and engagement is practitioner based, but it's substantial. Look at open then, which is dealing with ambiguity. It's the ambidextrous challenge. And I've referenced 3 different pieces of work that we've already talked about. And if you've incorporated any element of this into your leadership practice now, you're on the way. We need to look at ambiguity of leadership itself, which is it's ambiguous, right? Because what's a leader? Who is the leader? Am I a leader all the time? Am I a leader and follower? Your position, your identity here, your role that you play is ambiguous. In the context of a period of technologically driven change, leadership's problematic both in theory and in practice because of the ambiguous nature of it. Within a network, who leads? It's interchangeable, isn't it? Does that impact my position, my status, and how do I feel about it? I also go back to Smirchich and Morgan's seminal paper of 1982, still one of the best. Development of shared meanings critical to performance. The management of meaning, therefore, is the sine qua non of leadership. What does that mean, apart from me showing off? It's the essential bit. The management of meaning is the essential part of leadership. Where are we? Where are we going? How might we get there? What does it all mean? And Carl White wrote a really interesting series of papers on sense making, which I'll talk to you in a minute. And then we can look at the social constructionist perspectives. What is ambiguity? Well, it's the possibility of rationality not existing. It means that if something looks problematic and you apply more ration and reason to it, but it doesn't actually provide solutions, then you're dealing with a position of ambiguity. The world is uncertain. That's ambiguous. It could be this, it could be that, it could be any other things. Yeah. The reason that Alverson calls this paper Good, Bad and Ugly is because you're dealing with ambiguous concepts. You're dealing with ambiguous terms and terminology. Leadership itself is ambiguous. We might know what it looks like, but we can't describe it very well. We certainly struggle to define it. And any other role that we might play, because we play a number of different roles in that we can be leader, follower, manager, resistor, all manner of different things, maybe all in the same day. So we're ambiguous. Terminology is ambiguous. The future is ambiguous too. Digital leaders cope with it. They cope with it because they make sense. I'm not talking about common sense. That's not sensible. I'm talking about the making of sense. It's not about finding the correct answer. It's about creating and developing an emerging understanding picture that becomes more comprehensive and accurate over time, over experimentation, experience, and in particular, conversation. Yeah. The time is important here because just the application of more and more extant data is likely to be discordant. You get one view and then you get another view. And then you try and find more information to say, well, which one of the two views is the most accurate view? But it's conflictual and challenging. So data emerges over time. So we need to keep revisiting our picture. We are making sense in real time. And Weick uses a model, which he calls maps, mapping models. It's a metaphor. I think it's useful. It's useful for analysis and critical thinking. Consensual maps are a representation of or a way of seeing. So you can have a map of your own leadership, your own practice. What's my map look like? With the application of more data, learning, I'll change my map over time to create a new map, build a new map. Cognitive maps inside here is what sense making, the changing and the building of them and the writing of them is what's referred to as sense making. But Weick also says, or I think it's probably Weick actually, is that the map is not the territory, is that your mental map's not the whole thing. It's not it need not necessarily be an accurate reflection of the territory. There's only one way of finding that out, and that's by testing it. So how do we make sense? How do we make sense? How do we create sense? Is that we apply critical thinking. So what's critical thinking? When you take information, you examine it by asking questions about it. You interrogate it. And you put your insight to use in one of the following ways: solving a problem, making a decision by reasoning, opening your mind to discovering things, strategy and planning, strategy, behaving differently, believing differently, thinking differently. The process of which we keep banging on about at higher education. And there's a reason for that. Because without a critical or an application of criticality, we just continue to believe what we've always believed, irrespective of whether or not that might be the case or true or whatever it is. We have a leaning towards something which we now believe to be true. And I think that can be very endemic with people who are very socially conservative, is that we shouldn't be talking about gender or race or sexuality. But it's predicated on fear, isn't it? It wasn't like that when I was before, but it is. You can't not deal with it. So just deal with it and deal with it critically. You have to challenge your own assumptions and the assertions that you have made in order to make something true for you. Leaders do X, do they? Challenge yourself. Challenge others. Challenge the workplace. Does it make sense? Why not? What needs to change for it to make more sense than it did before? Examine the information and the underlying assumptions of that information by questioning it. And one of the most effective ways of questioning something is to try and prove that it's not true. Yeah? And then you create an argument. That's being critical. So sense making and lead, sense making highly correlate. God, my teeth are falling out again today. I'm struggling with my worms. I'm piss pronouncing my worms badly today. Hang on. Let's have a blast of whiskey. It's not, it's coffee. Whiskey late. Sense making is highly correlated with leadership effectiveness. Sense making enables leaders to have a better grasp of what's going on in their environments, thus facilitating other leadership activities such as I thought I was going to get through it that with ballsing up there. Visioning, relating, and inventing. Deb Brancona, Harvard Business Review. To make sense of the world so we can handle it and we are empowered. Sense making helps leaders to decide what they want to do and how they should do it. Here's an example of a map. You might know what that map is. You might not, but it's very difficult unless you've got some preconceived understanding of that map to actually work out what it is. Yeah. What's wrong with the map? The outline's very clear. It's a very nice blue, but it lacks detail. So we'd interrogate it critically so we could find out more about it. And we might end up with a map that looks like that. It's the same. Well, it's not, is it? It's similar, it ain't the same. What's wrong with this map in order for to be able to cultivate and develop our understanding? Well, this one's got more detail on it, but it doesn't look like it's detail that I can understand. And actually, the shape of this map is different to that map. This is an old map, and over time, old maps change. Here's another map of more detail. This is actually inside that map. But again, does it provide us with the right information? Does it help us make sense of something? So are your maps appropriate to what you're trying to find out? Test them, challenge them, question them, be critical. Different kind of map, giving different forms of information. It's the same territory, but it's a different map. So build maps. Maps is a process. Probably better done with others. Manage meaning, management of meaning. one of the lovely things about Smirchich and Morgan's paper is that they maintain that we actually can't comprehend the notion of organisation without leaders and leadership being in it. And we've become very fixed upon a particular map of the way that leadership operates within an organisation. It's ripe for challenge. Managers enact a particular form of social reality with far-reaching but poorly often understood, appreciated consequences, is that you can establish maps for people that makes it very difficult for them to be able to change them. Thinking about the management of change, are the leaders or the managers responsible for the inability to change because we've established too strong a map, or a map that is, I don't know, could be all sorts of different things, too simple, not enough detail on it, outmoded, all of the previous examples. But leaders make change, or leaders make meaning, but leaders also have power, which means that your statements, your meanings are difficult to change because of the power that resides within them. Yeah. It's very difficult to challenge the maps of the senior executive management who might maintain that the organization is X, Y, and Z. But your experience says, well, that's not the case. That doesn't mean to say that we don't necessarily, it doesn't mean to say that it's not possible to believe something that's not accurate. Depends on the map. And so Smirchich and Morgan maintain advocacy of learning. Not surprisingly, in the university, so do we. Learning requires you to do something different. Well, let me go back on that. In order for you to do something different, you need to learn something. If you don't learn anything, why would you change? No, I understand that we primarily promote a form of learning in a classical university sort of way, but there are other ways of learning from your own experience through critical questioning, learning from others and their experiences through conversation, engagement, and critical analysis and thinking, and learning within a university from theories, theoretical propositions, and testing them and taking from them all three scenarios, anything that you'd wish, and building them into your own practice. Because what's true is what works for you. But as far as this paper is concerned, or Smirchich and Morgan's perspective is that we should be learning from non-leadership scenarios and developing wider voices, a collection of wider voices. Think about the network and establishing the network where you are cultivating connections to wider voices, more nodes. The principle is the same. Which brings us on to social constructionism, which we talked about in the lecture series on Unit 1. Here, we're not engaged in leader-centric models. All members of the leadership relationship have the capacity to make their own meanings and are not reliant upon the nominal leader. It's an eye of the beholder view. It's the social consequence of necessary interactions between people, which means it's not controllable. The network isn't controllable. It's open to distortions of other agents. But leadership makes meanings. And because you've got power, is that you can establish the parameters for those meanings. Remember I said, it's not about thinking outside the box. That's easy. Any idiot can do that. Thinking inside the box is meaningful. Who establishes the box? You do. But leadership, therefore, your own leadership, is iterative. It's co-constructed and it's discursive. It's based in language, it's based in the realities of language, and it's based upon what's agreed between you and other people. the organization, the culture, your followers? Do you work, and is your leadership shaped by followers? Is your leadership shaped by your culture? Does your leadership in turn shape culture? These are all aspects of social constructionism. Co-constructionism is to actually impose a bit of order on it. So doing things in duos or trios, small groups, nodes, getting them to communicate with each other is a very effective way of building new, novel, and being critical. Language is important. You know, I said that there are 3 ways in which you can influence: reason. What was the second one? I told you this. I've not rehearsed this, or I'm doing it blind. It could go horribly wrong. Reason, charm. Well done. Thank you at the back there. And coercion. Language, it can be coercive. Coercive persuasion. That's based in reason with a bit of charm. But beware that language can be gendered. What's a strong leader? Both genders can be strong leaders, but is a strong man and a strong woman the same thing? It is. Language is political, in other words. We have to be careful about how we use it and how we frame it. And I'll admit I'm terrible at it. Try and get better, but it's not easy. Be aware of what we say. In terms of methodologies of co-constructionism, is that there's a really inspirational book called Conversational Analysis, I think it is, by Schotter. It's quite old now, 2008, but I'm trying to find a copy of it, and if I do, when I do, I'll put it on the reading list. Language creates and confines opportunities, responsiveness, and expressions. At heart, building reflection and reflexivity and rigors of critical analysis, the epitome of ambidexterity. But just conversations can have a telos. It can lead towards a telos. It can, as a point, even informal conversations might lead you to learn, suggest something. Just being playful within the conversation can have quite dramatic impacts, rather than saying, let's have a structured meeting. The conversation is the antithesis of a structured meeting, an agendarized meeting. The conversation just allows the flow of people to build on ideas in a dialogic or a dialectical manner, and to be able to synthesize something into something that's new. And that's the process of making sense. So be playful and be observant. And I'd argue that this was talked about in a book by a very famous sociologist called C. Wright Mills, in a book called The Sociological Imagination. Still worth reading. It's not available digitally, of course, not like most of the stuff that I've read or want you to read, but it isn't. And what Wright Mills talks about is a concern about wicked problems where there's no solution, ambiguity, which he refers to as an earthquake of change. Information in the age of fact is no longer sufficient. Well, we're living in that, aren't we? Post-truth politics. What he also talks about is actually the history and biography of organizations, and where they are really important. Changing those can create an unease and an indifference. That's not what we do. And really, the whole book is about asking different forms of questions. It's about sociological inquiry. It's about becoming a practical sociologist, or even a practical anthropologist. It's a practical social scientist, of seeing the workplace as something to be observed and examined and analysed, rather than just done. sometimes we have to step away from it to observe what's going on, as I say. What do I understand by what's occurring in front of me? What needs to change in order to make this better? I've done this one with you before, but this is the dialogic, is that the orchestra plays with the people next to them in response to, we work together. The jazz band has no nominal leader. They take turns to step forward and to play and to jam, and then the rest coalesce behind them and co-construct out of processes of novelty something rather wonderful, if you like jazz, qualify that. But you get the point. Yeah? And finally, let's look at the adaptive. Depending upon the nature, the acts of certainty, and whether or not there's agreement in terms of the way that we should act, different strategies can be utilized. And co-creating strategies, maximizing knowledge and resources of the group. That's essentially what they do. Co-creating strategies use the knowledge and the resources of the group, and they're conversational approaches. And this is something that David Lowe and myself are writing about currently, and will be in our book, which is due to be published next year. There's a link after this video where you can sign up to pre-buy a copy of that. It'll be very cheap. There isn't. Don't worry about that. I'm not asking you to buy it. I'm just saying that something I've considered. And what are conversational approaches? Things like affirmative inquiry. It's a conversational approach. Open space technologies, World Cafe, but action learning sets, anything whereby a group of people come together to talk informally, openly, and without fear of persecution. Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? But without somebody pointing at you saying, oh, that's wrong, that's rubbish, or that will get you into trouble. You can't say that. So something which is open, sincere, open, aimed at creating novelty and newness and different perspectives, and it's being critical. Adaptation or adaptive leadership, it's not new, it's quite old actually. It was originally posited by Heifetz, still a marvellous book, and the book is on the reading list as well. Have a glance at it from time to time. There's many, well, the whole book is excellent, and the introduction is very good, which sets out the rest of the book, and talks about wicked problems, which C. Wright Mills talked about. Although Wright Mills was writing in the 60s, Heifetz was writing in the late 1990s, I think. And a wicked problem is determined by a problem that we've not seen before, uncertain, digital transformation or change. Really, we don't know what's the results are. Simple problems can be say that, well, I've seen it before, I know what to do, I know how to respond. Complicated problem is I've not seen this before, but somebody has, and I know somebody who has, so I'll just ask them, and then I'll do that. A wicked problem is that nobody's seen it. So we need a novel response to it. The problem is that people treat wicked problems like simple problems and step in. The strong leader steps in and applies their own remedy based upon their own experience. Well, remembering, if we were living in a time where the world is changing faster than we can learn, our experience is unlikely to be relevant, no matter how experienced we are. So they fail to lead, but they command. This archetypal strong leader, and usually they have the usual experiences. They make a bigger mess of it than we initially thought of, or we couldn't even imagine. And I would go as far as to say Brexit was one of those. Brexit was a wicked problem. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Johnson did. Strong leader, stepped in, treated it like many of the other problems that he'd dealt with in the past, along with Gove and Mogg and all the rest of it. And they used a framing of neoclassical economics in order to assert that this is what was going to happen, and that was going to happen, and everything else that was outside of that was rubbish. Completely closed, strong leadership. Doesn't mean to say it doesn't have a resonance. We like it, because actually you could argue that leadership is just a crucible for one's anxieties. We're not sure what's going to happen here. Make it sound like it's all going to be okay. And it did, and we voted for it. And it's a proposal. One's experience, therefore, may be the problem. So adaptive leaders move from a singular approach to one that cultivates a shared approach. Leadership is found in a community which is built through diversity. Use all the resources that you want at your disposal, the knowledge and skills and the experiences of followers. And actually, I'll go further than that. I say stakeholders, all stakeholders. And somebody has to be a stakeholder for nature. Ask the right questions as distinct to providing the right answers. In short, the prevailing notion that leadership consists of having a vision and aligning people with that vision is bankrupt, because it continues to treat adaptive situations as if they were technical, simple. The authority figure is supposed to divine where the company's going and people are supposed to follow. Leadership is reduced to a combination of grand knowing and salesmanship. I cannot endorse that statement more. My alternative posture is to be stupid brilliantly. Ask the right questions in order to be able to facilitate a wider level of understanding. You don't need to know the answers. You can contribute, sure, but don't assert that just because you're in a position of authority that your answers carry more weight than anybody else's, because they're based upon your own limited experience, which won't work in an adaptive, wicked situation. The arts of adaptive leadership is end step change models. And again, I would bring in Lewin's postures, and I would also bring in the emergent approach to dealing with change. But we need data, relevant data. But who from? There's the interesting thing. We need the data from anybody and everybody that's involved in the impact of the decision, the change that's likely to be made. Somebody might need to advocate for others. So this means that data needs to be collected and taken from stakeholders, not just the senior management. Remember, I've said earlier on is that change is very often just managerialistic, which benefits a small group of people. Effective change and adaptive leadership takes the data from everyone who's concerned. And we then reflect upon it and we analyse it. And we might need to ask the questions that we need more data, or we'll go back and find some more data. But then we formulate agreed responses. Using the data at our disposal, we will decide what we're going to do with it. And in actual fact, what we might do is we might decide that we're going to do different things with the same sets of data, because it's not clear that one is correct or more correct. So we might set off a number of testable projects or testable hypotheses. So we'll test them, we'll learn from them. Rather than one great grandiose change that says that we're going to do X, Y, and Z imposed upon from the top, we'll bring the data and the opinion from below as to say that actually informed choice looks like these possible scenarios might be beneficial. We don't know. So we're going to test all of them in small controllable experiments, which requires limited funds and is less risky than actually imposing massive capital expenditure on something and hoping. Tends to be a bit traditional. Now, I'm not talking about sort of capex into things that we know, So, like as an example, go back into my industry, with this pub industry, is that spending some capital expenditure on a pub to upgrade it, so on and so forth. We know that works. So there's minimal risk in that. The risk is therefore about when you get to a threshold about how much do you spend and how much can you get back. But actually buying a whole new facility in a different place in order to try and do something different. I could give you an example actually. There's not pubs, it's restaurants and bits and pieces. Is that one of our brands was Hard Rock Chat Cafe, and I was seconded to a team to bring Hard Rock Cafe and Hard Rock Casino together. In other words, we put a casino on the top of a Hard Rock Cafe. At the time we were doing it, I just felt that it was just wrong. But they did it anyway. Spent a huge amount of money. It worked in Florida, in one place. It didn't work in Manchester. Yeah, I know, it's a surprise, isn't it, really? But we were working on it. We knew it wasn't going to work, but we still spent it anyway. We spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on this thing, and it was a disaster. And it was one strong leader's pipe dream. Now, you could argue, well, that's partly your fault, Paul, is that you knew. Why did you not say it? And I agree with you. But there are reasons that we don't do these things, don't we? Aren't there, rather, I should say. But anyway, that's the model for it. Data, reflect, analysis, agree, formulated responses, test and learn. And then you take the learning and then you can reiterate it around and develop the project to the next stage. It's less risky. The ambiguity aspect of it means that leaders need to develop two perspectives in order to be able to create informed choice. Get on the balcony, have a look at what's going on. Patterns, structural patternings, things in the marketplace. Take the wider view. Helicopter view I could have put on there, but HiFit says get on the balcony. So get on the balcony, but also make sure that you spend time on the dance floor with the people that you're working with, particularly stakeholders, important stakeholders, of which your team is predominant amongst them, but not exclusively them. Somebody somewhere once said that leadership's a full contact activity. I don't think they meant that it was literally physical full contact, but it does mean that you need to get close to people. Hence Isaacson's statement about jobs: close but distant, detail but big picture. It's the epitome of ambidextrous approaches. Last bit, just talking about leadership and change. Leadership and change are inextricably linked. Change requires leadership. But neither are value free. They are associated or connoted to a certain set of values. Value alignment, therefore, in change and in leadership is essential. There needs to be a requirement upon the focus on ethics of leadership and change from a consequentialist perspective. In other words, ethics that lead to behavior and outcomes. Organizational change can be a vehicle for domination. Benefits a small group of people. It's overtly managerialistic. Can work predominantly for the benefits of, say, shareholders to the detriment of stakeholders. Real change, effective change, is ethically propositioned, and you create a democracy of enactment in which the processes are open and transparent, which I would argue is easier said than done. But from that perspective, it's easy to see why the majority of change initiatives fail, because they're dominated by a select group who can see the outcomes for themselves as opposed to somebody else who was looking up and saying, and you want me to do this because I neither understand it, I don't understand how you've arrived at that position, and I don't understand what's in it for me. Why would I do it? Your individual moral compass influences your own leadership. However, is that in line with the ethics leading towards the telos, to the end state? Where are the foundations, the morals and the ethics within your own firm? And I'm talking about the real ones here. I'm talking about morals and ethics as distinct from corporate values. How should leaders respond to moral dilemmas that exist in change and digital transformation? And there are moral dilemmas. Does the technology displace individuals? Do strong cultural norms give rise to high expectations of style or to the outcomes and the way that we're going to do things? Cultures that are highly paternalistic, strong, predicated upon compliance, not likely to result in effective change at all. More likely to result in the expression that I use to describe the British military, which is to consent, but to invade. Invade. Too literal, Paul. Consent and evade, not invade. Do not. To consent, to agree outwardly, but to carry on doing what we've always done, in the belief that actually the proposed change was nothing more than an over-expensive waste of time. And this has an impact upon dramatic leadership. It goes back to a saying that was, what's good for General Motors is very good for the country, said Wilson, who was the chief executive at the time. Translated as being, over later years, as to be, what's good for me is good for the organisation, which my friend Chris Bones calls managers and leaders of this kind of ilk as being the L'Oreal generation. It's because we're worth it. Change which is orientated towards the careers and the successes of the already successful is not likely to be bought in and implemented. Leaders best serve their own interests by serving the interests of the stakeholders of the organisation, all of the stakeholders of the organisation. Ignoring the ethical framings of your business can seriously damage your organisation, but can also seriously undermine any attempt to try and change it. I've referred to this in the past. People change at different rates. I urge you to look at this book, by the way. It's not in the library. We've got it in the library, but we haven't got it digitally. But it's worth buying. And I would get the newest version, or the 40-year-old version, which has got a lot more practical help in it. They're available on Kindle for next to nothing. But people need to let go of something before they can move on and start again. But what's interesting in this bit is this bit in the middle, this neutral zone. The neutral zone is where we've accepted that things are going to change. But this is the neutral zone is where we negotiate with people as to what that change might look like. And it is a period of unprecedented creativity. Here, you will find all sorts of things that had not been planned. And this is why I suggest that the planned approach needs to be adopted with the emergent approach. But leaders here have a particular role here because they're conduits, they're crucibles of anxieties, and they're conduits of information to senior management and to others. They become a node within a nexus of change and a network about that change. Okay. So, got the full gamut of the information I wished to share with you. Thank you very much for listening. There is, as I said, for those of you still with me, a couple of announcements I wanted to make. One is, please fill in your feedback. I realised that our workshop was quite loose and quite informal, and over time I'd like to tighten it up, and I can do so with your help, and I would appreciate it. So please give me your feedback. The other thing is that post your workshop is that there is a reflective activity on Blackboard in weeks 5 or 6, depending upon which cohort you're in. I'll announce that, but I would like you to go ahead and complete that activity. It's not marked, but it is a requirement of the course. So it's a reflective statement which helps embed the learning that was taken out of the workshop, and it's important that you do it. And I shall look forward to reading those, and I shall equally look forward to seeing you all again to talk about your projects. You all take care now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.